report your state trooper.
I'm Trooper Dave Levandusky of the Indiana State Police.
I'm Robert Connolly. I go by Bob. My PE number was 2160. I was appointed on April 16th, 1970, and I retired in September, I believe September 26, 2002.
What made you want to become an Indiana State Trooper?
It was fairly complex, I guess, in reality. I wanted to serve the public in a way. I like firearms, and there was a connection there. But I'll tell you what I told the Board of Captains when we went through the interview process. I wanted to see things firsthand that other people were reading about in the paper.
Now, you mentioned that you had kind of a different background before you became a trooper. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it was probably a bit atypical. I had attended Butler University, and I majored in zoology, which was kind of I was actually thinking about going to dental school, and that was their pre-med curriculum. I really enjoyed my time at Butler. I was on the football team there. I played for Tony Hinkle. That was a lot of fun. So I was a bit unusual in my background, having an education with the basis in science.
Was there anyone in your life that influenced you to become an Indiana State Trooper?
Well, I'd have to say my parents would have been the most important influence. They respected the law. My mother was a school teacher. My father was a dairy farmer when I was growing up. And they were a big influence. But I observed state police officers. Had one actually pluck me off a hay wagon one time going down the road, who was looking for a missing person. And his mother had told him I knew this guy as somebody I'd met in 4-H camp. And this guy was the trooper, I don't know who he was, had me in his car. He was very professional. Asked me how the high school football thing was going and all that. So I was impressed with his bearing and his intelligence and the way he acted. And I had seen a few guys like Kenny Sale and Bob Clark, who preceded me, who were from my hometown, were on the department, and I knew they were good people. So I was somewhat interested in going with the federal agency, but I wanted to stay in Indiana rather than go to Detroit or New York City, as was common in those days. The fact they had a laboratory, and it was pretty well known. That was a consideration with the FBI as well, that I could end up in the laboratory. But in my long-range plan from the get-go, it was important that we had a laboratory because I thought I would end up there someday.
Did recruiting play a role in your decision at all?
Not really.
So you said you became a trooper in 1970. At that point, what was the hiring process like?
Well, it was stringent. As I recall, they told us there were about 3,000 applicants, and our recruit school has 75 in it. They were going to accept that many. And it was a 4-tiered process. In those days, we filled out an application. We took an IQ test. We had a physical, and it was stringent. And then we went before a board of captains for an interview. And that's where I told them I wanted to live the life that other people read about in the newspaper.
How were you notified about getting into academy?
I believe we got a letter. Said we're going to, it's going to start in just a few weeks. Told us what to bring. And our academy was quite controversial in that it was the first time, and I don't know if they ever did this again, to be quite honest, but we wore state police uniforms.
Okay.
Previous to that, they had worn these dress grays that they had to iron and so forth. They issued us used state police uniforms, and we wore a Sam Brown belt. We did not wear a gun in a holster or a badge, and they required us to wear these fur winter hats every time we went outdoors, and we detested them, but we wore them.
How long was academy?
The academy had grown to 12 weeks in 1970. We attended it for 10 weeks. I think there were 8 weeks before they had, I think we were interviewed by the State Police Board, and there was a cut at that point. And after that, we had first aid and firearms. We went to the field for about 4 to 6 weeks, and then they brought back half the class. For a month, we had another 2 weeks of training, I guess it was. Half the class went to breathalyzer school, and the other half of the class went back for an in-service school at Indiana University. So then the next week we swapped, and that was the first time they had done that as well. We all became breath test operators.
Were there any difficult moments during your time in academy?
You know, it was a great time for me. I really enjoyed it. There were a few funny things that happened. I guess a difficult moment was the day I ate 3 hot dogs for lunch at the Union, and then we went on a 3-mile run. I saw some of those hot dogs again. It was pretty embarrassing, but because I thought I was in great shape, you know. I used to kind of have contests for push-ups with John Little. He was one of our counselors from Evansville Post, and he was all man, and I wasn't going to quit till he said it was time. So it was a lot of fun. One day they tore up my bed. We made up our beds like the military, and the funny thing was, I had done this in college. I had been in a fraternity, and when I was a pledge, we had a guy who'd flunked out of West Point who made us make beds perfectly, and that would be a duty, and I might make 10 beds, and the guy would come in and tear them all up, and you had to make them again because they weren't perfect. So I knew how to make a perfect military bed, and they came in one time. I came in after class, and my bed was torn up, and I was used to hazing, so I just kind of laughed it off. And then I had the last laugh because after 6 weeks, my roommate decided to go home, and after that, my bed remained made because I slept on the floor on his mattress the rest of the school. Saved me a lot of time in the morning, you know, before inspection.
So after academy, where were you first assigned?
They sent me to the Red Key Post. Red Key was up in Jay County. It was a 4-county area, and they assigned me to Randolph County.
Now, you had an interesting first case when you were at Red Key. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I will. I guess first I'd like to say I mentioned my trooper trainers. There were only 3 troopers assigned to that county at full strength. And it was a rural county that had like a 4-person sheriff department, and they closed the doors at midnight. There might be 1 or 2 police officers working overnight in the largest towns, Winchester and Union City, but after midnight, if there was an accident and it was serious and you weren't working, you were going. They called you out of bed and you went. There was maybe 1 or 2 days a week did I have another trooper even work a few hours overlapping my shift, because one of the troopers I trained with, Larry Pritchard, was an acting technician. He had duties there. The other one was a fellow named Shane Fisher. And Shane, I believe his son also served on the department. When I was breaking in with Shane, his son was a toddler. And he was all business. Shane Fisher was all business, and he was a detail guy. He did not, peer pressure didn't bother Shane. He was going to do things right, no matter what. And when we went to get my car, my first commission, they gave us a camera and a first aid kit and things that day. And he said, did they give you, he drove me down, he said, did they give you a fingerprint kit? And I said, no, they're not handing out any fingerprint supplies. So he took me to the quartermaster and went up to John Jackman and said, we need some fingerprint brushes, some lifters, and some silver powder, some black powder, and all these, basic supplies so you could dust for fingerprints. Because those two troopers, when they worked a burglary, they tried to develop fingerprints, which was, they may have been the only two guys at Red Key that did that, but they did. So I took my car, and it turned out it was the car I trained in. It was his old car, a 69 Mercury. It wasn't as fast as a 68, but it was air conditioned. It was important. So I think I was off for a couple days. And my first day to work, you're going to be by yourself and you're all excited. You're going to go out and write a few tickets and patrol the roads. And I went to work, and about 10 minutes later they called me and said there had been a burglary at the Monroe Central High School. Well, this was a high school in the township I lived in, actually. It was out in the country. And I went over there, and it was a mess. And I checked to see if any detectives were interested in coming down, and for some reason they weren't. So there I was, the first day I'm ever by myself, and I got this burglary. And they had two buildings, and one of them was broken into was the shop, where they had the shop classes. And that was still very popular in those days. And there were probably 100 tools and power tools and everything stolen. So I had a long list of things that were stolen. They also got in the principal's office looking for money. And in both locations, they had broken windows. And to crawl through them, they grabbed hold of the pieces of glass and pulled those pieces out and threw them on the ground. Well, I dusted a lot of glass for fingerprints. I photographed the fingerprints in place, and I probably developed 12 to 15 fingerprints, and some of them look pretty good to me, but this is my first day on the job. So I preserved those, and I think I was there about 5 or 6 hours that day. Shane Fisher came to work late in the afternoon. I think he brought me, I ran out of film packs. We were using that 4x5 camera, and we'd only have like 8 or 10 sheets of film to shoot. So he gave me some film, and I shot a few more photographs. And anyway, over time, I didn't have a suspect, and this was before we had computerized databases. You had to have a suspect, and they had to have a fingerprint card on him in order to make a comparison. But over the months, probably about 6 months later, I developed a suspect. I got a search warrant, went to his house, didn't find any property, but I found a sawed-off shotgun. I got him arrested on federal charges, and we fingerprinted him. And lo and behold, one of those fingerprints came back that I had developed at the scene. And after spending time waiting to go to federal court down in Marion County, he decided he wanted to talk. And he gave up the name of another suspect, and we arrested him and got a hit on his fingerprint. I also had one of his, so I got 2 different people identified on fingerprints, the first case I ever worked. And I told that a lot of times in my career just so people would understand. I mean, physical evidence, it works, it can work for you.
Besides that case, are there any other memorable experiences from your first few years as a trooper at Red Key?
Well, there's a lot of them. I'm proud that I worked in a county like that where we had a lot of diversity. It was more than traffic. I worked a child cruelty and neglect case. Got conviction of both parents to 7 years in prison. I worked, and this is a uniformed trooper, so I was proud of that. I worked several other cases, a counterfeiting case, and the last 5 months or so that I was at Red Key, I was on temporary duty as a full-time investigator, and I only had about 3.5 years on the department, so I guess they thought I had some potential as an investigator. That kind of left Shane Fisher short out there in the district, you know, in the county, working the road. But I got to be a customer of the laboratory, and that helped me later when I was in the laboratory to understand what they really need, understanding the perspective from the other side. I waited a long time to get that fingerprint identification made. I couldn't believe it, how long it took. It went to Central Records. I had a marijuana case one time where it was coming to trial, and I went to the laboratory and said, or called him, and I'd already been there once because there was an article in the Indianapolis Star where Superintendent DeBard had said he's going to put more troopers on the road, and one way he's going to do it is take these police out of jobs in headquarters, such as the laboratory. So I went to the laboratory and introduced myself and said, you know, it's kind of my career goal to end up here someday, and I've got this background in science, and I was concerned about it, and they said, well, thanks for coming in. So when I did call about this marijuana case, Lieutenant Paul Aces said, well, come in and we'll let you analyze it. So I came in, and you can testify, and I thought, what? They were so far behind. We had 2 drug chemists that they hadn't got to the case yet. It had been there for months. And anyway, he showed me how to do the screening test. We did thin layer chromatography, Duquesnoy-Levine test, which was a 2-stage color test, and a microscopic examination. And he told me what all it meant. And I testified in circuit court to the identity of that marijuana in uniform as a trooper, telling them, well, I went to Butler and took 3 years of chemistry, and so they knew who I was.
What was your first car?
It was a '69 Mercury that I had broke in. It was Shane Fisher's car. He was happy to get a new car, and I got his. It had about 30,000 miles on it. And the camshaft was wore out. It started breaking valve springs rather. It would run up 120 with a broken valve spring though on 7 cylinders. Took a while to get there, but finally they put a new cam in and it ran pretty good.
And what was your favorite car while you were a trooper?
Oh, probably a 1970 and 71 Mercury. They were attractive, and they had when you opened the hood, it was impressive. It had a big chrome air cleaner, and I think it was a 429 Police Interceptor, and they had a 3-speed automatic transmission. It would shift at 60 and 97. And one thing about the cars that was really memorable was when we went to radial tires. We drove on bias ply tires, and they were good for about 8,000 or 9,000 miles. You were putting on a set of tires every 2 months. I was, and oil change every month. We drove quite a few miles, and the bias ply tire, I learned to drive on those, and they did not have near the traction of the radial tires, but you'd be going around a curve, and you knew all the curves in your county and what was the safe speed to enter those curves in. And if your car started to drift, you had quite a bit of warning. You could correct it and steer it. Told you you better give it a little more gas, or you better slow down. Well, when we went to radial tires, the car would really stick, and when the first thing, you know, if it broke, you were headed for the ditch. So I did like the warning, the sliding part and the bias ply tire, and still having some control.
Were you assigned to any special details while you were with the state police, like the fair or the Indy 500?
Well, I worked the 500 probably almost the first 20 years I was on. In fact, our lieutenant pulled a fast one. I'd been 2 weeks after I went to Red Key. I didn't have a car, and they called for sending 4 guys down for qualifications, and qualifications were really big in those days. They'd have 100,000 people the first day. So he put my name down and sent me down with another trooper who had a car. So he pulled a fast one, he thought. He sent a probationary officer down there who'd only been on 2 weeks. And it was quite an eye-opener. And then a lot of guys in my class worked the race that year, but and the race in those days, on race day you were on duty at 1 in the morning on the main shift, and you were on continuous duty at your site till maybe 6 p.m. after the race.
Oh my gosh.
And of course you had to travel to get there and travel to get home, so it was a long day. But back when I was younger, I could tell stories for hours just about things that happened at the race. I also was on a school bus inspection team. I really enjoyed that. I worked national drags. The last year I was a trooper, and I was really disappointed when I went to headquarters. I wasn't gonna be able to do that again because it was fun. It was a zoo. I mean, they were throwing beers at us, and they hadn't been consumed yet. They set fires. It was something, but we restored law and order and enjoyed it.
What was your first promotion after you were at Red Key?
Well, after I was Red Key, I was a trooper investigator on temporary duty at the time, and one Thursday afternoon, the phone rang at home. It was First Sergeant Ken Houck in the laboratory. He says, Bob, can you come down to work in the laboratory on Monday? And I said, what do you mean work? He said, well, you'd be coming down here to help the drug chemists. They got a terrible backlog, which I certainly was aware of over my marijuana case that I'd worked. And he said, you're going to be on temporary duty, but he said, I don't think you'll ever go back. You'll be down here forever. And I said, does my lieutenant know at the post? And he said, no, they don't know. He said, but if you tell me you'll come, he said, we'll make it happen. And I knew they weren't going to be happy at the district not being in on this decision. But I also knew that, you know, they might civilianize the lab, and this might be my only chance to get in. So I said yes, and I went down there on Monday. And I commuted for a while, and then I was able to find a place to live over that winter. And I did assist the drug chemists in many ways. Started the first day washing dirty test tubes, maybe 500 of them. They wanted to know if I knew what I was doing, how to wash them, use the right kind of soap, clean them with distilled water, and air dry them. And I had just left a job that after about 4 years, you feel like you've done everything once as a trooper, and you have the pride of knowing I know how to do my job. And now I'm down here at this place, and I'm washing dishes. And then they had me run most of the scientific instruments to create data. They taught me how to do the infrared spectrophotometer and ultraviolet spectrophotometer and different tests. I would create this data that the chemists then would use to form their opinion, and it did save them a lot of time. After 2 or 3 months of that, one of the guys, First Sergeant Elsroth, announced that he was going to retire, take a 10-year retirement, and go to the University of Illinois to teach forensics. They decided, well, what he does, he typed dried blood and these different things. Conley's got this background in biology, so we're going to ship him over there. So I worked about a month with him, and then he was gone. They sent me to several schools. They sent me to Georgetown University for a month. I believe in July 1975, where I learned some blood typing techniques and identification of body fluids and that sort of thing, hair and fiber microscopy. They sent me to another school in Chicago on microscopy for a week, and it was taught by probably the world's most famous microscopist, Walter McCrone. So they sent me to good schools, but the laboratory wasn't set up those days. When they lost somebody, the next guy had to come reinvent himself. They were one deep in everything they did. They had a firearms examiner, and they had somebody that did trace evidence and biology.
Was it mostly troopers at the lab at this point?
We had 2 drug chemists. Jim Forbes and Ann Rummel were the first 2 drug chemists we had. They both had been employees over at Indiana University and came over about 1970, and that we still were stuck at 2 when I went to the laboratory. Then we had Ron Mertens, who was in photography issues. He had responsibility for cameras and such statewide, but he was more or less a forensic photographer, and he also went to surveillance scenes to do that kind of work photographically. Paul Asa was the assistant lab commander, and he was running blood alcohols. He testified quite a bit. And Kenny Houck was doing firearms, tool marks, and polygraph, and he was kind of wanting to get out of firearms because he was testifying a lot. And I showed an interest in firearms because it had been kind of my hobby. I had grown up with guns. I had a shotgun from the time I was 10 years old, and I was reloading shotgun shells when I was 18 or so. And I enjoyed shooting the pistols as well. So I had an interest in this sort of thing, and he knew it, and I knew my way around a microscope. So I finally got to get into firearms identification, and I really enjoyed that a lot. The problem with that was I was the only firearms examiner covering the whole state except Indianapolis. The Indianapolis Police Department had their own firearms examiners, 2 of them, and then I had all the rest of the counties. And when people got shot in those days, a lot of those cases went to court. So I found myself by 1978, 79, I was going to court on average once a week. I actually testified in 104 trials in 2 years. I'd say about 102 of them were jury trials. Most of them were homicides. Some of them were rapes, where I'd done some biological work. But I couldn't go anywhere in my private life or even hardly go to schools. I had 5 subpoenas to testify in 5 counties on 5 homicide cases on a Monday morning, twice. And one time, I also was scheduled to be in Baltimore for a week for a homicide seminar to become a member of Harvard Associates in Police Science. Well, I had 5 subpoenas that week, and all homicides. Well, I talked to all 5 prosecutors, and they all said, yeah, it'll take us 3 or 4 days to set a jury, and then but the state's case will go into the next week. We'll put you in the next week. Well, I had it all worked out, and I told my boss I did. And so I fly to Baltimore. I go to school the first day. It was great. Go to school the second day. It was great. That afternoon, they said, we need you to testify in Porter County, Valpo, tomorrow on a homicide case. I said, really? Yeah. We bought you a plane ticket. You're going to fly to O'Hare. There'll be a trooper there to pick you up. He'll have your notes. Boom. So I flew to O'Hare. There was a lot of snow on the ground, I remember that. And I testified late that afternoon, and then I didn't have a car or anything. They had to relay me back home. I was living in a house on the family farm between Danville and Plainfield. So they drove me back home, 2 or 3 troopers. And on the way home, they called me and said, you're needed in Scott County tomorrow morning. So I had to go by the office at 5 in the morning, get my notes, drive down to Scott County, down near Louisville, and testify another homicide that day. So that's how I spent my week at that homicide seminar, testifying in 2 homicide trials.
What position did you hold that made you most proud?
Well, I think I'd have to say trooper, and then when I was a forensic scientist, a firearms examiner, equally so. I think we have to realize I had supervisory authority most of my career, I guess, but the most important positions, the reason we exist is for the people that do the work. I used to call it the level of execution. Otherwise, the people that are doing the work is what all the rest of us are here to support. They're not here to support us. We're here to make sure they know what's expected. We have the right people, and they're trained properly, and they're supervised properly. We review their work, and if it isn't right, we make corrective action so it gets better. So those would be the positions, the ones where I was actually doing the work.
What path did you take to get the highest rank that you had while you were with the state police?
Well, Kenny Houck was right. When I went to the laboratory on TDY, I never came back. I was there about 4 months, and after it was announced that this one first sergeant was leaving and I was going to fill his spot, the major came to me one day and said, here's a letter, I've asked that you be promoted. There was a vacancy there for a first sergeant, and it hadn't been filled for over a year, and they just put me on it, and that was it. I'm just suddenly a sergeant on a first sergeant's position. And I worked there doing my job as an examiner, working cases, until down the road a few years later, Ron Mertens had become the division commander, and he was a captain at that time, and he called me into his office and said, well, they're building new posts at Lowell, Fort Wayne, and Evansville, and we're going to staff them as laboratories, regional laboratories. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, we're going to do that. And I said, well, what are we going to do there? And he said, well, we're going to do fingerprints, which I thought was good, firearms, polygraph, biology, and drug chemistry. And he said, what do you think? And I said, I think it's a real bad idea. I said, you know, we had brought in Bill Kuhn from the field and Mike Oliver, some guys with the right kind of education. They were working in the lab, and we'd gotten to the point we were too deep. So, you know, if somebody left, we at least had 50% of our output. We were going to be one deep again in all these regional. I said, you know, it takes a year to train a firearms examiner, and if he leaves, we don't have a firearms examiner for another year. He said, I know, but we got to do baby steps. And he said, it was just it. You're going to be in charge of training these people. And Jim Forbes and drugs are going to train the drug chemists, and you're going to make sure that the rest of them get trained. And I'm going to promote you. You're promoted to first sergeant. And he gave me a title, criminalistics coordinator or something like that. So we did. That's how I got my second promotion. We got those laboratories staffed, and we also built our laboratory at Indianapolis, and we moved from the state office building on the first floor. It was a 3-room, it was a catastrophe. I mean, we were all packed in this room. I was shooting firearms all the time, even high-powered rifles in a room where we had chemists doing, you know, identifying drugs with high-powered instruments. And this was in the state office building. It was amazing how we had to operate in those days. But we were growing fast. We were adding some personnel, and we moved out here, and we had all the laboratories staffed, and things were getting a little comfortable. And I put in to go to Southern Police Institute Administrative Officers Course, which at that time was a little more respected than the FBI Academy during those years. It was an intensive 3-month course down at the University of Louisville, and we took like 6 classes a day, and it was intense. I had one class down there that every day of the week for 12 weeks we had a test. I graduated from there. And at the graduation ceremony, I was elected to class orator, and I was speaking. And the major came down to see my graduation, and he said, well, when you get back, we've just been taking on all the field technicians. Every district had a field technician who would handle photography issues and work crime scenes. He said, they're going to work for us starting next month. And we're also taking over the evidence system for the entire department. So every piece of evidence at every district, we're going to be responsible for. We got to write the rules and all that, which we had none. I mean, when I was at Red Key, we had a closet. That was our evidence room. I never put anything in it because you might never see it again. I mean, we kept evidence in the garage and in the trunk of her car. That's just the way things were. Well, it was time to tighten up that ship. He said, we're going to bring Mike Medler down and promote him to lieutenant, and he's going to be in charge of the field technician program, and we're going to promote you to lieutenant, and you're in charge of the scientific side, in-house side. So just like that, they just told me, you're promoted. You're going to be promoted. I didn't, there was no opening. Mm-hmm. So now I'm a lieutenant, and that goes along really great. The field technician program wasn't popular in the field at first because people lost somebody under their command. They're working for the laboratory now. We had to deal with that a lot. And it was a lot of hard work, but after about 2.5 years, Lieutenant Medler and I, we were kind of running things. Major Mertens was kind of running interference for us, and we were comfortable. And we'd go run 5 miles a day at lunch a lot of times instead of eating lunch, and buy a pretzel and a Coke and come back to work. And we'd run and talk about how we're going to make the laboratory better and all that. And I got back one day, and Colonel Spence was in the office, and he said, well, I want to talk to you, Bob. Next Monday, Major Mertens is leaving. He's going to go down and be in charge of training and personnel. And I thought to myself, oh boy, he said, you're going to be in charge. And I'm just kind of sitting there, and then it comes to me, no problem. Lieutenant Medler and I have been running things. And the next thing come out of his mouth, and Lieutenant Medler is going down to run training section. So now, I mean, they're just gone.
Yeah.
Like in 3 days. Mm-hmm. And it was a scary moment, a very scary moment for me. Other people stepped up, and I worked hard, and we got by it, and we grew from there. But that's, he told me that you're going to be a captain. Of course, it was a major slot in charge of a division. He says, because Colonel Delman says he's not going to promote you to major for a year. You're going to have to be good for a year at captain, then we'll promote you to major. So that's how it happened. So 12 months after that, I became a major, and that's how I got promoted. And I never had any, I never asked for any of these promotions. Mm-hmm. I didn't put in for them. I didn't, I'm a dinosaur. That will never happen again. It never happened again, and I'm sure it won't now because of all the personnel rules.
No, it probably wouldn't happen that way. But they were obviously earned, though.
Well, I hope people think of it that way.
What was a very difficult case that you had to handle while you were a trooper?
I think the one that people might be most interested in, and it was a ton of work, was the Hollandsburg case, what is referred to as Indiana's St. Valentine's Day Massacre case, where we had four brothers that were victims of a homicide in their home in Hollandsburg, Indiana, near Hollandsburg.
What year did that take place?
Probably about 78, 77, somewhere in there. I was working firearms identification full-time.
And what was your involvement?
Well, I got to work in about 10 minutes, having a cup of coffee. I guess Kenny Houck, who was the captain at the time, came in and said, the major and the captain, investigation division, Stan Kenny, was the major. They're going over to Wishart Hospital. They're bringing these bodies in for autopsy. And they just wanted you to go with them to see if there's anything. They were shot with the shotguns, and see if you could offer them any information. Somehow I took my camera, and a lot of film, and a lot of containers to put evidence in. I thought the technician from the district would need it if I didn't. With that many people shot, there'd be a lot of evidence. So I had a lot of what we call new pillboxes and tape and marking pens and envelopes, all that kind of thing. And I prepared that. And I get in the car with them instead of driving over. They want me to get in the car with them, so they drive me over there. And they bring in these 4 bodies, and the pathologist his name was Jim Benz. He was the only forensic pathologist in the state of Indiana at the time, and he laid the bodies out on trays on the floor in the way they were recovered at the house, because those boys and their mother were forced to lay down on their faces, stacked up, almost touching one another on the living room floor, while 4 guys just shotgunned them all. For no other motive but to kill people. Well, the technician came from the district, and he was there till about 11:30 and decided he had to go back to the scene. So, to make a long story short, I was there till 11 p.m. And conducting those autopsies. I collected specimens of shot and wad components from shotgun shells, took well over 100 photographs, and I was able to identify that 2 different gauges of shotguns were used, and identify 3 different brands of shotgun shells and 3 different shot sizes. Some of the shells were fired from a 3-inch Magnum 12-gauge shotgun, and then there was a standard 2 3/4-inch 12-gauge shotgun, and also a 16-gauge shotgun, and they were Federal type wad columns, Federal Cartridge Company, and at number 4 shot. And I did that just with the shot and the wad components because these guys had picked up all the shells and took them with them that were ejected on the floor, because they didn't want to leave any evidence that could be linked to their guns. So they were some of them were fairly smart about that. Well, they threw those guns, it turns out they threw those guns away out a window over a fence somewhere near Turkey Run State Park, and there was snow on the ground. And about a month or 2 later, somebody's driving by and saw a shotgun. They called the state police, and they went out and picked up that gun, and they took it into the jail at Crawfordsville, where they were questioning one of the suspects. His last name was Stonebreaker, and he looked like somebody in the composite that the mother had helped him draw. And they were talking to him, and they brought that shotgun in the room, and it was the one he had used. And he thought the gig was up, and he just starts talking. And they said, well, where are the other shotguns? He said, well, right out there with that one. So they go back out to the scene, and sure enough, there's 2 more shotguns out there. Anyway, I got a call, and they said they're bringing in these shotguns to you, and they're going to be loaded. So this was really a nervous time for me. Jim Thompson and I went out in the parking lot. I said, well, we'll meet him in the parking lot. We're not going to unload these inside the building. I got 3 shot sizes, 3 brands of shells, 2 gauges, and some of these shells, the 3-inch Magnums, hadn't been manufactured since 1957. This is, 1978 or so.
Yeah.
So this is something real rare. Well, we got those 3 shotguns, and we opened them and took the shells out, and they had exactly in them what I said they were going to have in them. So one of the greatest half hours I had on the department was seeing those shells come out of that gun being the right, because we knew we had the right guns. And we were able to substantiate everything that this witness said, this co-perpetrator, which is necessary to get a conviction. When a co-perpetrator testifies, it must be corroborated, or the judge is going to direct a verdict of not guilty, because co-perpetrators are not very trustworthy.
Yeah.
It was the second time I testified to all this evidence, the second trial. And the prosecutor wasn't really raising issues about chain of custody too much. He was introducing the evidence, and he got to this one box, pill box, and he said, have you seen this before? And I said, yes. And what is it? And I told him it's a wad component from a 12-gauge shotgun shell, and it was made out of fiber, and it's a type loaded by the Peters Cartridge Company, and all this information. Well, he went to introduce it as evidence. He made a motion to the judge to introduce it as an exhibit, and the defense attorney has a chance to always object at that point. And so he decides, he has an opportunity to ask me a question, and his question was, where was this item the first time you saw it? And I looked at my notes, and I'm sure my eyes got big like they are now, because he's used to hearing an answer from somebody like me, like, well, at the laboratory when I cut open the box, and on this date and time, I saw it. He said, well, where was it the first time you saw it? And I said, it was in the front of John Smith's skull, where his brain should have been. And the room was pretty quiet. I thought that's kind of prejudicial, but he asked me the question, and that's where I saw it. So he didn't ask me hardly any more questions that day.
And all three of these men were convicted after this?
Four. There were four.
Of them,
one
yeah.
was a juvenile. They were all convicted. A couple, I think, have died in prison. One may be out now. It was one of the finest cases in terms of the field work by our detectives. I think Lloyd Heck was in charge of the investigation. There were guys out of Terre Haute and Lafayette Post that worked on that case. There's victims of all these crimes, and their families, and finding out the truth on their behalf is important. And so it was rewarding.
Were you on any specialty teams while you were part of the department?
With my workload in the laboratory, that was just not possible. I did train, I guess I did qualify to be a sniper. There was a short period where it was decided we needed to have some response team at headquarters for the people that worked there until a SWAT team could assemble and get there in case there was a threat on the governor's office or this or that. And so we took a week and we went down to Atterbury, and I qualified as a sniper. But then once we got regional, they called them ERT teams at the time, regional SWAT teams, they let that program slide. And so I never really had to serve. I was on pistol teams for many years. I don't call those specialty teams, but it was very rewarding to me, and it was my hobby. It was my golf game. There was two kinds of pistol shooting. One of them was the conventional bullseye, and we had a history of that on a department. And we had an annual match in a high 20 club. But also in Indiana, actually down at Indiana University, they had started competition in police combat shooting using the PPC course, the practical pistol course, that we used to qualify on a department. And during the early 70s, that sport blew up. When I went to my first national championship in Mississippi, they had a cutoff point at 960 officers. There were 960 police officers there competing. And so it kind of took over as a sport. I started shooting here in Indiana, and there would be 80 to 120 officers show up every weekend for a match somewhere around the state. So I got involved in that pretty heavily, and it turned out after about 3 years, I was the fourth person in the country, it all happened in about 6 months, to shoot a perfect score on this PPC course. And I got, somebody at the Law Enforcement Academy made a lot of publicity out of it. I did a bit on TV, Channel 13, shooting, and I got a certificate from the Law Enforcement Training Board, and a lot of publicity in the papers, which led to the department getting speed loaders for our officers. And I think that's an interesting story. We were carrying these nice looking dump pouches and these .357 Magnum revolvers.
Now the dump pouches are the ones that you have to open from the bottom?
They had a leather snap, a flap that was snapped on the top and the bottom, and you put the shells in the top. If you flipped open the bottom one, they were supposed to drop out in your hand. Well, if they did, it was rare. Now, I had mine lined with metal. It helped a little bit. Some of them, they'd get all warped. You couldn't get the shells out of them. You have to open both flaps and pull. Now, you're in a gunfight. You've shot 6 shots. You got to, you're trying to get these out. They were worthless. And Colonel Bob Klein was out at the range one day when I was shooting. And he's a legend on the department and a real leader. And he was kind of amazed at how fast I was reloading and how slow I was shooting when I shot the course. He said, "What are those things you're using over there?" And I said, "Well, they're called speed loaders. You can load 6 at a time." He said, "Really?" And I showed them to him. And I said, I can empty my gun and reload and shoot again in 3 seconds in pitch darkness." And he said, "No." I said, "Yeah, I can." I said, "Come down to my office in the laboratory and I'll show you." We didn't have any windows, and we put 6 empties in my revolver, and I would click it and eject and load 6 rounds of live ammo and close the cylinder. And Jim Thompson was in there. He flipped the light on, and the gun was loaded, ready to shoot again. I did that 2 or 3 times in about 3 seconds. And 6 months later, everybody in the department had speed loaders. He and Superintendent Shettle, I said, "Well, we'll see if we can come up with the money. This could save somebody's bacon," and we did. And then another thing that happened later was I was put on the Firearms Review Board, and then I raised the issue that the ammunition we're carrying, our 357s, is a poor choice. Ever since we had gotten those 357s, we were carrying a soft-nosed 158 grain bullet. There were other rounds out there. There were federal studies, funded studies that have been done that would indicate that we'd be much better off and the public would be safer if we use a lighter hollow point bullet. The rounds we were using would just go through people and have more potential to hurt other people, and it might take more shots to stop them from doing what they're doing, which is what this is all about.
Yeah.
The 158 grain bullet did not print very close. If you didn't resight your gun, you could shoot a perfect shot at 25 yards and a 158 grain bullet would be high. Well, we found that the 125 grain bullets would shoot within 2 inches of the wad cutters. So that was another reason why we should go to that round, and it convinced them and they bought it. And we started testing. Jerry Waller would actually do that. We would test every lot of ammo after that the department received for accuracy testing from a machine rest out of Jerry Waller's revolver. That was the control. And so we tested every lot and made sure it printed within 2 inches of the practice ammo we were using, and it was accurate enough at 50 yards. And we continued that process till we transitioned to automatics.
Are there any other stories that you would like to share with us?
The technology change I saw from 10 people in the laboratory to when I left, there were about 135. I don't know how many there are now. My job changed. I started doing things that would take 7 to 10 years to get done, like building a new laboratory or changing our classification from chemists to forensic scientists so we can get their pay compared to forensic scientists in other states. Many people were instrumental in all the changes we made in the laboratory. I guess the first one I'd like to mention would be Kim Epperson, who gave her life in the line of duty. She was one of the first biologists we hired up at the Lowell Laboratory. She moved to Indianapolis area to help implement DNA analysis when that technology came on board. And she was going up there to provide training to somebody the day she was killed in a traffic accident. Great loss. I lost other friends. One of the guys I went to recruit school with was killed with his own gun first year we were on a department. John Happel was a very good friend of mine, shot on the pistol team with him. His wife wanted the pistol team to be his burial, to bury him and be the honor guard. And we trained to do that, and that was quite an honor for all of us. Something you'd never forget. Eric Lawrence is one that's still there that was a civilian employee that I actually knew when he was a boy in Danville. Been a great influence over the years. I feel like when I left, we had things, the people there the chain of command and the people in the positions, because we had achieved accreditation, laboratory accreditation in 1991, and to maintain that status, you've got a balance of personnel that can keep things going. And we can train our own people, and we can make sure they're doing a good job, and we can test and validate our own the procedures that are in use. And there are many processes that would bore you that I never knew about when I was doing casework back in the 70s that we put into place, so that after all these years, this laboratory has never, with the thousands and thousands of cases they've worked, there's never been a major embarrassment due to incompetence coming out of this laboratory. And I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud of the database work, the APHIS system, that there was something out there it took about 5 years to get it, but we did. Then we had an automated system for firearms that does searches on unsolved firearms cases, and then the DNA database. And I think one of the greatest honors I had was, in a way that I won't forget, was after the database became active, we actually had 3 cases pretty soon in which there were people in prison and they were the wrong people. And not only did we tell them they were the wrong people, we told them who the right people were. If we had an opportunity to exonerate somebody in any case, convicted or not, we'd relish to have that opportunity. We want the truth to prevail.
Of course.
We had 3 cases where we went to the prosecutor and the police departments and told them, to see the shock on their face, and then tell them this is the right guy. It made you feel like, boy, we've come a long way from when I walked in the door. So, yeah, that was quite something. I guess the other thing that was very fulfilling to me in the later years is I got involved in an association called the American Society of Crime Lab Directors, and it was a real honor to be a police officer with mostly civilians who thought enough of me and the Indiana State Police that I could become president of it. And then after that, later I served on the Laboratory Accreditation Board, the world's largest laboratory accreditation board, served on it and was chairman of it while I was still in a department. And it accredited all the federal laboratories and state laboratories around the country. To come from the dairy farm to that point with on the Indiana State Police was a great deal, and I did get to see things that other people read about in the newspaper, that's for sure.
What are some things that you learned about yourself during your time with the Indiana State Police?
I learned that I could get things done through people. It's important to know your people, what they would take, what they were prepared to do, and understand that different people have different personalities. One thing a manager can do, for sure, all of us, just learning not to demotivate people, listen to their ideas, and when you're making big decisions, get your knowledge from the people that know the most about it. They may be at the bottom of your group. One thing I can say that I'm proud of in the laboratory is that very few people that went there during my career who were from the field, the police, they didn't leave. I mean, it happened, but it was very rare. Guys that come there, they'd want to spend the rest of their career there. And I think that says something. The other thing is that I thought was a marker is that most of the years I was there, I would say 80% of all the employees in the entire division didn't take a sick day. I would give them all a letter of commendation every year that they did that. And I mean, I'd have some installations, like maybe the Evansville Regional Laboratory, nobody in the place took a sick day all year. You know, there was some real pride in the organization, in our division.
What do you want people to know about the Indiana State Police?
I guess most importantly is we're there for the people. We normally, especially when we're talking law enforcement, we talk about standing up for one another, and we are a real brotherhood and sisterhood. There's no question about that. We have common concerns and common fears that really make us bond to one another. But our ultimate client is the public. It's people like our mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, the people we went to school with, the people we go to church with. The police in America are supposed to be part of the public. We're citizens too, and we need to. I think in the Indiana State Police, I think that's a well-founded value of our employees.
Do you have any words of wisdom for young troopers or people that are interested in becoming troopers?
Well, I do think, and I'm not an expert on this topic, but from what I do see, our current administration understands that as law enforcement in Indiana evolves and all these small departments are getting bigger, we're creating a lot of jobs for specialists. I see a lot of good things coming out of the people that are working cybercrime. And there's a lot of things you can do. Trooper's job, very important. All these jobs at the level of execution are important, and there's a variety of them. So your career can go different ways and fulfill the interests you have as a person if you just come to work, do your job. I look back and I'm proud to work with the people I work with, and from the outside it looks like that environment continues.